Look, well, I think that the drawing is a tool to explore and discover and to test. It's a fundamental part of thinking through making. You know, Glenn Murcutt talks about it, that it's like a physical activity that's related to making. And I don't see how you can design spaces without drawing. And I don't just mean that as, it's another technique of representing space, because, we do have computers and things like that can represent space. I do think it's actually about how you think about space, or how you actually understand space, because it's not until you really draw a space that you've actually thought about it. I think people look at something and think they understand it at a glance, and they just simply haven't. I know that from experience. Students confuse drawing with representation, and there's plenty of other ways to represent. And that's probably why they really dive quickly into a computer model, because they can make the 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective really quickly and easily. Or you can take a photo of something. You don't need to sit there and draw it. Thinking spatially is a different technique. So plan and section. If we have technology, and you can imagine being an industrial designer and seeing a competing product and thinking, Jesus, that's really good. I want to create a product like that. What do? You reverse engineer it. You actually unscrew it, take it apart, and you look at it and you learn all the bits and you go, shit, I can do that actually better. And then you evolve, and and that's what we do in architecture. We replicate what we've seen before, and we hopefully make it a little bit better. And you do that by reverse engineering, but there's only one way to reverse engineer it, and that's by drawing. You actually inhabit a space, and you cut. So you get the giant chainsaw in your mind, and you cut a line through it, and you actually understand the spatial consequences, and you do that in only one way. The same with the plan too, and it's not until, and I know, we've talked about this before, it's not until you've been forced, there's a privilege in being forced to take time. The pen forces you to slow down time. You have to look, and you have to look again and look again, and it's not until, the sixth time you've looked at something, you've really gone, it's actually like that, because we make assumptions.
Exactly, yeah.
And we now live in the Instagram age where, that happens over and over again. You think you understand a building because you saw, a pretty photo of it. And it's amazing how through the act of diagnostic drawing, or reverse engineering as I like to call it, you can really, show the emperor's got no clothes with some buildings. They take a great photograph, and then you just quickly cut a section through there, and you think about that as a humanist, how are people inhabiting those spaces? And you soon realise that some of the things that look great in a photograph are actually bloody terrible buildings. It also reminds me of what we were talking about before about Brisbane too, how it's really difficult to take photographs of, a lot of Brisbane architecture. And that's because I think there's been a sort of tradition over the last couple of decades which is about what is the nature of that space and how do we contain it. So the actual nature of the space is more important than the container itself, which is quite different to, especially when you look at, somewhere like, Melbourne, or somewhere like RMIT, where there's a lot of architectural gymnastics going on about the envelope. And that's what is the container of Swanston Street is really the question they're asking. Well, it's going to be a really decorated container because the street is the way it is, where there's a different sort of discussion happening in Brisbane. What is the nature of the space? And then it's just capture the edges of that however we can. It makes it really hard to take a photograph. It's much better when you go and explore it. You even get much more out of that process when you stop and take a good proper look. A really good way to take it, to affirm whether you actually are looking is if you can draw it and then look up and go, yes, I drew what's on there. Because so often it's amazing, even somebody that's got so much experience to draw something and then go, it's not like that at all, actually, and then you've got to go back and do it again. It's just an ability of looking. And you're just not looking unless you are making a second representation of it, because otherwise it is this interpretation, this mind trick, unless you've got backup. Well, the whole reason to draw is because it takes a little bit longer, forces you to stop and think. To teach those skills requires people to patiently sit and work with people, many of whom have not drawn before, and help them acquire those skills. And unfortunately, there's been that much money stripped out of higher education. The funding is so tight, actually it's about speed. So I don't know how, it needs to be taught. Universities, I understand why there's pressure. There isn't the luxury of time. There isn't room for patience, and drawing requires patience. And we live in an age where everything's got to be put up as quickly as possible. I don't know how it sounds, but like you almost need to be taught how to see in a way. Otherwise, you're just a tourist. You're just rocking up to the Eiffel Tower and taking a photo in front of it, pretending you actually looked at the thing. You turn up to a building in Europe and accumulate them on your phone as you take photographs. But I think the idea of saying, well, hang on, stop and draw a section. Or, I think it's interesting the idea that turn up somewhere and somebody articulates something about that building through words, which we're all very comfortable with, and actually saying, oh, okay, that's an interesting observation. Can you draw that? I really like this column grid. Okay, can you actually show what that means in section? And they might discover a whole bunch of things about that column grid actually has a series of steps that goes down into some sort of shared public space, and there's quite a different sense between those two levels. What does the colonnade, give you spatially? All those things are waiting to be discovered, but it can't happen if you just rock up and take a photo and walk away. What employers want is speed. How do you test ideas quickly? And this is the thing. Before I was saying how drawing requires patience, learning those skills requires some patience to learn those skills. But then once you've actually acquired some, I'd say pretty straightforward skills of representation, you can test ideas really quickly and work out whether they're valuable to pursue or not. Or you can illustrate ideas very quickly and then go to whoever you're working with and say, look, I thought it could go this way, that way, that way. If you sit down on a computer and start building an incredibly accurate model of one journey, you'll pretty quickly find that one of your seniors will come across and go, we're not doing that. We're going to, or they might say, that's a really interesting idea, but we're actually going to retreat and we're going to go this way instead. You just don't have the plasticity that you have in drawing. And so this, I get really frustrated when I say, hey, can you just test out a few things? And then find that people have built this, gone and covered all these textures over this 3D model. I'm like, whoa. I just want to understand arrangement of spaces, see what opportunities on this incredibly tight block are. I don't care about, this level of detail you put in. I don't care about how accurate you built your model. There's a problem with that.
So it's about purpose, efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hierarchy of information.
And strategic thinking. That's what we're doing all the time, is we're providing clients with a strategy for life. We're applying strategy all the time. Part of what employers want to see is strategic thinking in process as well. And if you've ended up spending a whole day building a 3D model that is just suddenly worthless because it's one iteration of a whole bunch of possibilities, then your employers pretty quickly to go, well, that's not very strategic, that's not very efficient. Because the reality is that what we do as architects is we try to, at the end of the day, show something that looks inevitable, and simple. We're our worst enemy. Oh, look at this building that I built, isn't it perfect? That comes from loss. That comes from trying out a shitload of ideas and testing them out and chucking them in the bin, and then maybe getting them out every now and then, but it's not just one journey, and a computer often commits you to that. So that can be really frustrating. Now, I think the way that you deal with a computer in an office scenario is super important, and it requires some experience. You need to be able to draw some ideas really quickly before you get onto that. And that's something that we're really happy to help people with that. Don't dive in too early, but definitely get into it because it's such a useful tool. But if what you're doing is actually just going into this safe place, I know how to build in a computer, you haven't been able to test all of the many possibilities of what this design could be. For students, at some point, they've got to draw. They've just got to draw. They've got to learn that skill set, almost in isolation. And then later on, the computer can come in to help you, to give you a much wider range of representation. That's what we find. And so we end up going into the computer and thinking, back at drawing, just do this lovely dance. Instead of being scared of one of them, you get all the choices. You need to be able to illustrate something, and you can't just do it through words. You can't bugger off for 2 hours and draft it on a computer. You need to be able to really quickly do it. You do that through drawing. It's easy. Oh, it's just going to end up, the Archie Marathon Drawers will end up filling the hole that's been left in architectural education, is core skills that every architect needs. Ways of thinking and ways of representation that are fundamental to how architects think. And I mean fundamental, because if you go back and you look at any important architectural texts over the last few hundred years, there's thinking within that comes from drawing out of that. I mentioned Hermann Hertzberger's, and there's plenty of other books where it is obvious that this is described and explained through that reverse engineering of spaces.